We are thrilled to welcome Oguzhan Atay, co-founder and CEO of BillionToOne to the show today. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Drew.
Absolute pleasure, Oguzhan. It's great to see you. Would love to kick things off, just starting with just a brief personal intro. Do you mind sharing a bit more about your background, more on the personal side before you got to BillionToOne?
Yeah, of course. So I'm originally from Turkey. So I'm a first generation immigrant here. I came to Princeton for my undergrad, where there is this incredible integrated science program that combines different disciplines to solve problems in biology. So that was kind of a very interesting start to, looking into biological problems from first principles. And then I did my PhD at Stanford, where I follow that same workflow, same trend in understanding biology from mathematical, physical, computational principles. And that's kind of where really BillionToOne is. We have this very different approach to molecular biology and molecular diagnostics, where we try to solve problems as if they are physics, math problems, essentially starting from the design principles.
And so glad you touched on that, Azan. Really excited to get into the fundamental principles of BillionToOne. And just to start this conversation as a primer, do you mind just sharing a personal genesis story with BillionToOne?
Yeah, of course. 6 to 70% of healthcare outcomes, um, you know, including survival rates, quality of life, are actually directly attributable to diagnostics. So this is fascinating. Diagnostics is so important in being able to change so many different verticals of healthcare. But, unfortunately, there is not as much innovation in diagnostics. I think it is changing in the last decade, but previously it wasn't so. And even though it is truly the bedrock of healthcare and healthcare outcomes, so you know I've always been very impact oriented, and I think I really see diagnostics as a way to, if you can transform diagnostics to be more powerful, being able to innovate in diagnostics, that can really make a much bigger difference than you could really make in any single therapeutic area. And in that sense, we started BillionToOne because when we looked at diagnostics, we saw that the approaches were, quite brute force. Essentially, it was more trial and error approaches that biology tends to have. And we realized that essentially, especially with cell-free DNA testing, there is so much more signal there that if we approach it from a molecular perspective, essentially looking at the problems from a perspective of, can we count molecules? Can we actually detect the signal here? Can we, remove all the noise that is being introduced by the laboratory processes? What is possible? What can we do? And we realized that, especially, the first test that we developed was about sickle cell disease and beta thalassemia. And that is not even, if you think about it, those are the most common genetic conditions in the world, not in the US, in the world. So we started with a very global problem, and we essentially wanted to tackle that because we realized that if we are solving the biggest global problems, the rest of it will follow. And if you look at that particular problem with cell-free DNA testing, you would realize that it is possible, but just barely. It is at the edge of what is possible, from a physics perspective. So we had to really develop a technology to be able to do that. And, from there, we were able to expand into other conditions and even other diagnostic verticals.
Really appreciate kind of the initial genesis of how you thought about where the beachhead was for BillionToOne. For yourself personally, once you were getting a little bit closer to that finish line, starting to decide where the best application around cell-free DNA diagnostics would be, what was the focus going into prenatal care, starting on those areas? And for you on the personal side, really, what was the spark that started it all to say, we're spinning out this company, we're starting, and we're going to start scaling up to what you are today?
It wasn't really about building a company, right? It was really about solving a really important problem. And if you think about it, sickle cell disease and beta thalassemia, until recently, there is actually not even reimbursement about testing for those conditions on a genetic setting, even though they are so important. That is changing now. So we had to figure out, how we would get paid from insurance companies, once we solved the problem. But we started with essentially that problem because we realized that it is an important problem, and we were even thinking more globally that in developing countries there are a lot of sickle cell disease, beta thalassemia cases as well. So how can we detect these conditions so that these global burden is mitigated? But quickly, once we are solving that problem, we realize that the technology that we are building would be applicable to so many other areas. So one of the interesting things is that, even if you look at our, 2018, before we raised our first Series A, you would actually see this completely laid out from, what the first product in prenatal would be, what the second product would be, what the oncology products would come next. So, we understood what the implications would be and, how we can expand into other areas. But a lot of the time, solving actual, the product problem or the technology problem is 1% of the work that you need to do. 99% is actually changing the standard of care. And even if you have something that is so much better, it actually takes tremendous effort to be able to commercialize it and then scale it. So, we wanted to make sure that we are not focused on too many things because as a technologist, as a founder, you always want to solve new problems, focus on new products because it is more fun to work on those things. But I think we were very careful in making sure that we are building products that the people that were solving really critical problems, and that we were bringing it to the market in a way that we would be able to get reimbursed, because that was the number one you know requirement for being able to scale it to a solution. But then, we didn't jump into oncology immediately because we knew that it would take a lot of effort and building a commercial team and scaling it across the United States before we would get to a place where we would be able to tackle new problems.
And certainly the reimbursement angle is a conversation I'm excited to have when we talk about implementation of the business strategy going through. But as a primer here, just getting a bit under the hood of BillionToOne, I wanted to provide a little bit of technical context just for our listeners. As we're talking about BillionToOne pioneering this molecular diagnostics focus on cell-free DNA, I wanted just to open the floor and start here as on really, what is cell-free DNA and how is it used to detect disease?
Yeah, this is one of the most interesting fields of all of healthcare. It really started about 10 years ago. And, especially with the developments and the exponential progress in sequencing technologies. And what happens is that as all of our tissues, grow and divide, some of the cells die. And those dying cells, apoptosing cells, release their DNA content into the bloodstream. So if you take a vial of blood from any person, you would find essentially representative DNA from every tissue in the body. And this is a really remarkable thing because it is kind of like a microcosm of your entire body in a vial of blood, especially in terms of the genetic and epigenetic information that you can get from that DNA, right? So what this allows you to do is essentially start looking into problems, first on the prenatal side, for instance, because the fetal DNA is getting into the bloodstream of the mother as well, the pregnant mother. So if you can take a blood sample from the pregnant mother, can we identify genetic conditions in the baby, that would benefit from early treatment, for instance. Similarly in oncology, the tumor is also shedding this DNA as the tumor is growing. And you would be able to essentially find what mutations are in the tumor, again, from a blood sample, so that you can, for instance, predict cancer early, or if someone already has cancer, being able to predict what treatment is going to be best based on the mutational profile, or be able to monitor whether that treatment is going well or not. and be able to predict months before it would show up in a scan that actually, this tumor is growing or this tumor is shrinking. So the possibilities are really limitless when it comes to cell-free DNA, and it is really, completely transforming many areas of healthcare. And some of the diagnostics, have already become standard of care, but the others are, I think, really going to make, big improvements in what we can do. What we have done, what we started with BillionToOne, is really take this cell-free DNA diagnostics, right, this blood-based diagnostics to its physical limit. So we have the only technology that can get into a single molecule sensitivity with cell-free DNA testing. So we are able to essentially detect even, single gene conditions like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell disease or spinal muscular atrophy, directly from a maternal blood sample, whether the fetus has these conditions. And the outcomes are tremendously improved. If you know that that baby is going to have sickle cell disease or beta thalassemia, you can do cord blood banking. If you know that that baby is going to have spinal muscular atrophy, you can start that baby on Zolgensma or Spinraza literally within the first week of birth, and that improves the outcome so significantly for these very severe progressive conditions. So we are very excited about how much healthcare is changing with molecular diagnostics, and how this is allowing us to save really, so many lives, both on the prenatal side, but more recently now with liquid biopsies on the oncology side.
Of course. And it opens up such a great conversation about reimbursement when it comes to preventative medicine and early detection, and excited to go there deeper. But as someone that really has been at the cusp of this field for the last decade around cell-free DNA, someone who's seen this space evolved has now pioneered a company that has grown tremendously and has improved to the physical limitations of what the space has been now. I was curious just to ask as well, what do you see as the current challenges that you're witnessing within cell-free DNA-based diagnostics?
So I think, one of the challenges with cell-free DNA is that the amount of material in a vial of blood is limited. So it means that essentially you really need to get to these single molecule sensitivities to be able to not miss mutations or have false negatives. So that really allowed us to, I think, be able to develop diagnostics that are not just, 10% better, but that are 10 times better, that are qualitatively different from other companies. And that has been, one of the key points that allowed us to grow so, rapidly with, capital efficiency as well. One of the other challenges that we see, though, is essentially the problems of reimbursement, right? Whenever you see this, explosion in innovation, the healthcare tends to lag in terms of, supporting that type of innovation. And this is particularly, true in diagnostics, right? Gates Foundation sponsored a study that looked at, why there is not much more innovation in diagnostics, because I think they also realize that diagnostics is, so important to healthcare and preventative medicine. And they find that the reimbursement by far is the number one reason, because it can take years before the medical guidelines and the associated reimbursement catches up with the innovation that you are trying to have. Even if the doctors want to use it, even if it is improving the healthcare, not just outcomes, even if it is improving the healthcare costs, like it still takes tremendous time before you can actually get a test covered and then get in network with the insurance companies. So one of the strategies that we followed here that I think was a very I think it was a very smart strategy, and the reason that we had to come up with this strategy is that I'm a first-time founder, and sometimes like not having access to huge capitals to start with essentially forces you to be creative and smart about how you are approaching a market. And that, I think, really helped us. And what we did here is that we really piggybacked on what already exists in the markets, what is covered by insurance already. So, with the products that we have chosen to launch originally, we could have said that, oh, we are just going to take a, blood sample from the mother, and then we are going to do a cell-free DNA testing to determine whether the fetus is, whether the baby is affected by one of these conditions. We wouldn't have, I think we wouldn't be paid at all, and we would have to, like, burn through probably $1 billion of capital before that would get reimbursed, and it wouldn't be possible, right? We wouldn't get the capital to be able to get there. So, that is sometimes what we see with other companies when they are building a good product, but it is just the reimbursement pathway to getting to that point is, multiple years away, and it's so difficult. What we did was we, combined our tests with something that already exists and that is covered by all major insurance providers. So, for our prenatal testing, for instance, we first screened the mother from the same sample to see whether the mother is a carrier. Of course, it is like very easy to do, right? It is just determining of the two genes that we have, for each of these, whether one of them has a pathogenic mutation. That doesn't mean that, the mother has any, symptoms, you are just a carrier. And it certainly doesn't mean that the baby is affected, but it is part of standard of care. There are existing CPT codes, there is existing, payer coverage for determining whether the mother is a carrier for these conditions. So what we do is that we first do that test and we get paid for that test, even though that is actually not the result that, providers really care about. But then, we determine whether the fetus is affected or not. And that essentially, gives the providers and patients a lot more information, the information that they are looking for. It allows us to grow our business, but we are not getting paid actually on that innovative part. Like, even today, there are only a handful of insurance companies that cover that innovation that we created. But that's okay, because on the established component of this, we are able to get paid, and that allows us to continue to scale the company.
That question obviously rings true to most modern diagnostics companies. When you talk about access to CPT codes and fitting into standard of care is obviously a massive question. It's been amazing to see yourself, Oguzhan, and the BillionToOne team really try to enter out and see what's on the front lines of care right now and how you all integrate it. It's an amazing strategy. To continue a little bit deeper, as we discussed a bit of your prenatal care work and some of the benefits for prenatal testing and some of the works where you fit in already. I did want to dive in just a little bit deeper and just talk about the clinical advantages. And so maybe could we just dive in, if you could speak on the clinical advantages that are really typically more accurate DNA quantification and quantification of more sparse DNA fragments really yields at front lines of care?
Of course. So, for a physician who is very busy, they are not going to focus on the technology and how you have a really cool technology. They need something that is very concrete. And, with the problem that we have been tackling here in the prenatal space, there are already established medical guidelines that say that, these pregnancies, every pregnancy should be offered screening for these single gene conditions like cystic fibrosis or SMA. The problem is that, after you screen the pregnant mother, 1 in 6 pregnancies will come back as positive. That creates a lot of anxiety for the pregnant mothers during a sensitive time. They need to go through a genetic counseling session to understand what it is. And, of course, most people don't even know what it means to be a carrier. When you are a pregnant mother and you get a result that says positive carrier for SMA, you don't Google what does carrier mean. You Google what SMA is. And, that is not an easy result to get, because it is such a, difficult, progressive, severe condition. And at that point, that doesn't mean, again, the baby is affected. So after genetic counseling session, after you educate the mother on recessive inheritance and Punnett squares and how recessive inheritance of the condition would work, you need to test the partner, the father of the baby. And the problem is in the United States, like this results in so much inequality in healthcare. I wouldn't have any problems going in the next day to get screened, if my spouse is like positive carrier for something, I could get out of work next day to get tested. The problem is, though, that is not true for actually majority of the US population. In fact, 45% of US pregnancies are paid by Medicaid. And if you are underinsured or if you don't have insurance when you get pregnant, you qualify under Medicaid. And Medicaid pays for the standard of care carrier testing. The problem is that in those families, usually the partner, father of the baby, doesn't have insurance either, but they don't qualify under Medicaid. So Medicaid pays for the initial part, but can't pay for the partner testing a lot of the times. And even if you have an insurance that would pay for it, not everyone can get out of work to go to an OBGYN office. And the OBGYN office is very busy, and the partner is not even a patient of the clinic. So then, even after you do all of that work and test the father, you are still at 1 in 4 risk. So you need to do this invasive procedures for 4 pregnancies to identify the one that would be affected. So you go through this, multiple step diagnostic odyssey. 50% of the time, you are not even testing the fathers because the fathers, are not available for testing or don't have insurance or can't get out of work to get tested. And at the end, you still have to do a lot of unnecessary amniocentesis. So what we tell OBGYNs, providers, is that, look, you're already taking this blood sample. You're already sending it to one of the existing labs. If you send it to us, we have the only test to tell you not only whether the pregnant mother is a carrier for one of these conditions, but we can also tell you whether the fetus is affected or not affected, high risk or low risk. So that streamlines the workflow for the clinic. So it is better for the patient. They are not going through weeks of anxiety and diagnostic odyssey. It is better for the clinic. They are not wasting valuable staff time trying to do an intake with the partner. And it is better for healthcare outcomes because you are not missing more than half of the affected cases because you don't need to rely on partner testing, right? So we have essentially been able to offer something that is better for every single stakeholder, and that essentially becomes relatively easy you know you know sales cycle because I've essentially never met an OBGYN or a provider who said that I don't like what you are doing, I don't want to use your test. Really, the process becomes I had 9 out of 10 OBGYNs when I was first interviewing that would tell me when can I start. But even when they are saying that, that still takes tremendous amount of work because you need to set up the logistics. Who's going to draw the blood? Who's going, what is the courier? Where is the, tubes going to be shipped? So all of that logistics and, the healthcare system work actually is, the work that we have to do to get more and more providers using our tests. And, we tell our sales reps, your work doesn't, it doesn't end when you get the yes from the provider. It actually starts after you get the yes.
100%. It's an amazing dive into seeing kind of the modern diagnostic workflow of that entrance into standard of care is something I absolutely want to dive into later on, but it's amazing to hear your initial thoughts is on. To dive in specifically, as we're still on a little bit of insurance conversations and a little bit more of this broader public health conversation, it's great to hear the overview of the Unity screen and chatting a little bit more about your work in prenatal care. One little tidbit I wanted to add beyond this was some of your initiatives starting in 2020. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine recommended NIPT as the screening test of choice for all pregnancies, as compared to historically recommending testing only for pregnancies for women older than 35. But really, as a result, by 2021, we saw approximately 80% of insured patients in the US had NIPT coverage. And so as we're still kind of continuing on this policy conversation and the rapidly changing regulatory and healthcare environment, I'd really love to just understand your thoughts on how Billion to One can or already is helping to engage to drive the public health discussion when it comes to many of these codes, billing, all conversations that really talk around and surround policy.
Definitely. I mean, as a reminder, NIPT for aneuploidies, for Down syndrome that you have been mentioning, the ACOG guideline, that work started not even with us, with the previous generation of companies back in 2012. And the guideline changed in, 2000, 20, 21, 22. So you can see that there is almost this 10-year difference between when something is launched to when something is universally covered and becomes standard of care. So, and that is, changing even today. Even, in the last few months, there were a few additional payers that started covering NIPT for aneuploidies, and that definitely helps us, right? Because that allows us to get better reimbursement from those particular payers. But NIPT for Down syndrome is really the first step. Now we are doing NIPT for these single gene conditions. We are expanding the number of single gene conditions that should be screened as part of first line screen in these pregnancies. There is a more recent, for instance, NIPT that we have developed as the first in the offering this since 2000, I think 20, is determination of RH status in the fetus. So this guideline changed, but it was the first step. So there are so many other steps that are coming, and those are the areas that we really focus our efforts on. And in particular, for instance, there is a nationwide shortage of ROGAM. For um, reviewers, ROGAM is a fascinating has a fascinating history, right? It is one of the most important interventions in maternal fetal medicine. It saves so many lives. It is something that is so effective, so simple, and it has been around for decades. And that allows essentially this um, red blood cell incompatibility between mother and the fetus, right? If the uh, mother is Rh negative and the fetus is Rh positive, there can be this incompatibility in red blood cells, and that can result in significant problems. And ROGAM prevents this. The ROGAM is actually a name of a product. There are a few alternatives here as well, but anti the administration prevents this. What we find is that right now, because of this nationwide shortage, that we are running into an issue of trying to preserve the ROGAM shots that we have. And we have had this only test in the United States for RHNIPT that determines which fetus is Rh negative, so that we can preserve 40% of the ROGAM shots. So, this is again one example. We have another partnership with J&J about another red blood cell antigen, issue where the fetus is at very high risk, because there is already existing alloimmunization, existing incompatibility, and they are trying to go through a phase 3 clinical trial globally to develop a solution for this. So in many ways, being able to have these really innovative diagnostics is not just helping the diagnose and help manage the pregnancies, but it is even it is helping to enable the drugs that wouldn't even be possible to go through and identify and be able to be given to right pregnancies. So I think one thing that we are seeing is that the more clinically impactful the diagnostics is, it becomes easier to actually change the guidelines. So for instance, with RH and IPT, because of this recent shortage, ACOG had a recent change in the practice advisory to say that our RH and IPT, for instance, can be used to be able to determine which pregnancies should get ROGAM shot or not.
Which is amazing to see that traction already. I'm really happy you discussed a bit of your work around ROGAM, your collaboration with J&J, because it really touches to the work you and the team have really made for the platform you've developed. One thing we certainly have undertouched that I would love to focus on as we're switching from prenatal care is a lot more in your work around oncology. I would just love to start and chat a little bit more about North Star Select, North Star Response, the two programs that you all are running out as products, and potentially what led BillionToOne to continue your work into liquid biopsy. What was that pivot? There's been so much innovation in that space in the past few years, and excited just to hear your perspective on all fronts.
Yeah, definitely. So, if you look at the problems that we focus on, we try to solve the largest problems that we can. So, prenatal testing and oncology touch, these two areas touch almost every single life, right? Everyone is born at some point. And right now, I think the statistics shows that, 1 in 2 to 1 in 3 people who are alive today will get cancer at some point in their life. So either, ourselves or someone that, we intimately know will have this problem. And, even when we were developing, as I mentioned, back in 2018, the first prenatal test, we knew that, there would be the application in oncology and that how we would be able to solve really significant problems in liquid biopsies and oncologies. But we also understood that those were, I think, larger markets that would require, more clinical studies before we could launch it. So strategy was essentially, to start from prenatal where the markets are, as we talked about, is, there is a more beachhead perspective that you can actually make a bigger impact in a smaller market and be able to gain market share more quickly. Whereas in oncology, I think you need to do more clinical studies to be able to make that impact. But one thing that we realize in oncology is that because the problems are, very similar technically, but potentially even more challenging, our technology makes even bigger difference, right? Essentially, when you have a 10x better technology, the more difficult a problem is, the bigger your differentiation would be. So we built two pan-cancer tests, a therapy selection product that determines essentially what the mutational profile of a tumor is from a blood test, and then a response monitoring product, essentially after the therapy starts, being able to longitudinally measure the amount of tumor DNA in blood so that we know in real time, essentially, that, whether that tumor is growing or shrinking. And that can be, months in advance of a PET-CT scan. So both of these areas are, I think, especially, starting from late stage cancers, are going to make a tremendous difference. Therapy selection has been an area that had other companies and other products in the past few years, as you mentioned, and they have been very successful in changing standard of care. And our idea here was very similar to prenatal testing, where we would essentially have these two products, one on an area that has existing reimbursement and another on an area that is, really groundbreaking and novel in monitoring, cancer response. What we find is that even on the therapy selection side, where we didn't think that we would have a huge advantage, that in head-to-head studies that we are finding that we can detect 50 to 100% more actionable mutations, compared to existing tests. And I think that is because, when you are down to a single molecule level with, oncology with liquid biopsy, it makes a big difference. One molecule versus 10 molecules, there are actually a lot of, cancers or tumors where, the actionability lies in that range. And I think that is, why we have been able to grow so fast on the oncology side as well, because it's not just a monitoring product that is groundbreaking, but even the, therapy selection product that we have is able to offer so many more, you know, therapy options for the patients because we are finding these actionable mutations at those, very low levels that other tests may not be able to capture.
And it's certainly exciting to see the impact that BillionToOne is already currently making in the space, and excited to see the future of your all's involvement within the oncology space, within prenatal care, and wherever y'all expand. And as we're discussing this and looking a little bit more future facing, I wanted to take a quick step back, really just to address some of the amazing work and progress you all have made at BillionToOne with your pioneering and exciting approach, increasing the resolution of cell-free DNA testing, and at this point, fundraising almost $280 million to date. I usually just like taking a step back halfway in the episodes, really just to discuss major challenges and accomplishments. To really start things here from your perspective is on building this entire group and this whole side. I mean, from your perspective, what have been some of the greatest challenges that you faced building BillionToOne?
Yeah, I think, the I talk about, three pillars of success. You need to have great product, you need to have great vision so that, you are not trying to do everything. You focus on a few problems that you care about, you solve them, you build 10x better differentiated products that, give you a very strong mode. But the really it is the third pillar, the execution, that becomes so important. We usually focus on the vision and the products, and they are definitely fun to talk about, but it is the execution that is so difficult and so important. So if you look at our revenue graphs, they look, these extremely nice exponential graphs, unprecedented growth, more than 100% year over year. But behind that, every single quarter, there's so much work that goes into making that possible. Whether it is a challenge on commercial scaling, whether it is a challenge with, payer contracting, it is not easy. Even though we had the strategy of, combining a reimbursable product with something that is more innovative, it was still not easy because we were out of network, right? And that has been actually one of the challenges that we really had to overcome, because the payers don't want to, get in network with you if you have very small test volumes, right? They don't want to deal with you. But of course, providers and patients, they want to use in-network labs, right? Because, that is, better, more cost effective. So you really have to make sure that you can actually, still be accessible and affordable to everyone while still being in out of network. And if you are out of network, you are not going to get paid well by the insurance companies either. So that means that essentially you have to build assays that have, very low cost structure so that you can, absorb some of the denials that you are getting. And there is a lot of, catch 22s in those early days. So we really had to overcome a lot of problems. And really last year was a breakthrough for us. We went from, at the beginning of last year, 80 million contracted lives in the entire United States to now close to 200 million in contracted lives, including some national contracts that we have been able to sign with Aetna and Cigna. So I think that made a huge difference. But it was so difficult actually to be able to make that transition from being an out of network, lab to being a mostly in network lab. Um, and even today, those challenges remain, but they are so much less compared to what we had even just 15 months ago.
I completely agree. And seeing the growth, the meteoric rise, to be honest, it certainly comes with the challenges. It's amazing to see from your perspective what really stuck out as some of those large logistical challenges. To flip this on the other side as well, as we've talked about the amazing progress so far, I just would love to know from yourself is on, what have been some of the greatest accomplishments or milestones that you've personally been excited about that you and the team at BillionToOne have reached?
So, you know, looking back every quarter, we send out this update about what we accomplished, and it is really amazing to see every quarter we are able to accomplish, I think, what most companies would be proud to achieve in an entire year. Both in terms of product, the clinical studies, the execution, the payer contracts, the reimbursement, the cash collections. Every team, the sales growth is doing an amazing job in being able to drive the company forward. But interesting thing is that y- even though we have achieved a lot of those accomplishments, we always think about essentially where we are as day one, because you see so much more that is in front of you that you have to do. So in many cases, even though we have built amazing products. We have right now, 125 million in ARR. We have been able to raise significant amounts of fundraising, and we have been able to do all of these with, really high gross margin products that we were able to build and improve over time. Um, you know, at the end of the day, I think, what we look at is what remains to be done. And in that sense, you know, even though I think, building these products that are now starting to be seen as standard of care is, I think, the greatest achievement. Like, if you go talk with uh, some of the key opinion leaders across the country, they would be able to say that, the leading company here is BillionToOne, and they are saving lives. And I think that patient focus is the key, right? Saving lives is the thing that I am most proud of, and the teams that we have built to do that is what I am most proud of. But on the other hand, I also think that we are at 1% of what we need to do. There is still 99% left.
And so much to be done, and incredibly exciting to see already the amazing progress and impact. But I would absolutely love to flip it to the future, and really having discussed Billion to One and your approach to date, would love to talk about what's coming next. From your perspective, is on, what's coming next for Billion to One?
So, what is coming next is essentially, continuing to build these products to become truly the standard of care. I think, right now, we are at a level where, we are the number, we were number seven just, 2 years ago. We are number two provider of any prenatal molecular diagnostics test in the country. And we want to continue to grow and make our tests truly the standard of care that they should be. So there is going to be, continued growth on that part. And as we are doing that, we will be adding more and more essentially solutions that help drive the field forward. But it is really on the oncology side that I see, a lot more growth to be happening as well. We started with these two groundbreaking products, one in an existing field, but with a 50 to 100% more mutations that we can detect, and in another one where we are really creating the field and moving that field forward by being able to do response monitoring. But that is only for late stage cancers. You can take the same technology and start moving into earlier stage settings. In stage 1 and 2, the same technology can be used to determine MRD, minimal residual disease, right? To be able to determine after surgery, is there anything left? Did the surgery completely remove what was identified in stage 1, 2 cancers? And eventually, even to early detection, where asymptomatic healthy people being able to catch cancer early. Because if we can move this from the current late stages to first stage 1 and 2, and then eventually to early detection, what that would mean is that that would mean getting as close to curing cancer as possible. So, eradicating genetic, disease on the prenatal side, being able to treat the babies and make sure that they have, as healthy lives as possible. And then on the oncology side, again, getting as close to curing cancer as possible. I think those two are, really big goals, and it will take us a long time. It will take us, 10, 20 years to achieve those goals, but I think they are worthy goals.
And they certainly are amazing goals. And as we're talking about decades in advance, wanted to bring a few rapid fire questions to close off the episode, but pretty relevant to this topic. Really, as we talk about this, to set a specific date, I mean, imagine it's 2050 from your perspective, Azan. Could you describe the cell-free diagnostic space where you are in BillionToOne are?
So I think 2050, there is certainly going to be a multi-cancer early cancer detection test that everyone is taking once a year, and it is able to identify not only that, whether you have very early stage cancer, but that essentially it is also enabling us to determine, where that might be, so that the next clinical actionable steps can be taken, the tumor can be removed. I think the rates of cancer, people having late stage cancers or from dying cancer would significantly diminish. On the prenatal side, two of the biggest problems right now are preeclampsia and preterm birth. The problem is that the clinical actionability of even having a diagnostics is very difficult to ascertain. But by 2050, maybe BillionToOne not only is essentially finding, what the conditions and the diagnostics of preterm birth and preeclampsia are, but combining it with, certain actionable steps so that those two biggest problem in maternal fetal medicine can be significantly reduced. And if we are at that point, I think the number of lives that we would be touching would just be incredible. So it's kind of really exciting to think about what that would look like, and potentially at that point you are not even just a diagnostics company, you are a diagnostics company that is enabling therapies, because that is one thing that we are finding that is becoming more and more true, right? In healthcare was really focused on therapeutics, even though diagnostics is driving the healthcare outcomes. But with differentiated diagnostics, with the improvements in AI, with the personalized medicine that we can have, it can be diagnostic that is driving the healthcare. And that will certainly be a very different world where we are making, I think, tremendous progress so that we are not managing disease, we are catching disease and eradicating before it becomes disease.
And it's an incredibly exciting initiative. It's amazing to hear from yourself, Azan, seeing the future at the top of BillionToOne. Really, just as we're closing up this conversation, any other closing thoughts or shameless plugs you'd like to share with our audience?
Um, I think it's just one of the things that I want to say is, diagnostics is um, such a great area for the future. So if anyone is, thinking about where they can make the biggest impact in terms of, saving humanity, saving the world, diagnostics can be an underserved area right now. And especially we are at a point where, we are at an inflection where molecular diagnostics is going to be the future of healthcare. So if anyone is listening and, wants to work in diagnostics, we are hiring across many, many roles.
It's incredibly exciting to see, Azan. Thank you once again for joining us. I mean, I know we had this exciting conversation again a few years ago when the North Star program was just beginning. It's amazing to see the progress thus far, and follow on the journey. And once again, just so grateful for the sit down and taking time to discuss the past, present, future of BillionToOne. So thanks once again, Azan, and
Thank,
appreciate your time.
thank thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all the amazing questions that you asked. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Absolute pleasure. Pleasure's ours. Thank you so much.